What's up, you guys? Dr. Goodin back with another lecture video, this time talking about basic nutrition factors for health. This is from Chapter 9 from the Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist textbook put out by the NSCA. Before I get started, it's important to note that I am not a registered dietitian. I am a qualified strength and conditioning coach. I have my doctorate in sport physiology, but I don't have any degrees in nutrition. I have taken quite a few advanced nutrition courses, but this information all comes from Chapter 9 from the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. So this is by no means me telling you what you should do with your diet. I'm not qualified to do that. However, this is me helping you study for the CSCS test using the information from Chapter 9, okay, so that we can employ that with our athletes, give them some guidance, but refer out when necessary. So let's jump right into the material. Okay, this comes from Chapter 9 called The Basic Nutrition Factors in Health, written by Marie Spano, who is a registered dietitian, so she does know what she's talking about, unlike me. So the objectives of this chapter, we want to first know when to refer an athlete to the appropriate resource. Oftentimes that's not us as a strength coach. Whether that's a medical doctor or a sport dietitian, it's super important to be able to refer them out when necessary. Next, we want to identify the different protein, carbohydrate, and fat recommendations for our athletes, in other words, macronutrients. Then we want to be able to list the dietary recommendations for disease prevention and overall health. Remember, this is all about health, not necessarily about performance. Chapter 10 is about performance. Chapter 9 is about how to eat for health. And it's important to build from health into performance. You can't have good performance, at least for the long term, without health first. And finally, we want to list hydration and electrolyte guidelines for different age groups and scenarios and help athletes to develop an individualized hydration plan. This is super important especially when you have longer duration training sessions, or you're training in the heat or high humidity, or you have two-a-days. So super important stuff here. All right, first of all, the role of sports nutrition professionals. Sports nutrition professionals have varying degrees of knowledge. Okay, you have registered dietitians who, that's sort of like the baseline for what you would consider a nutrition professional. Now you also have sports dietitians. They can be more geared towards athletes. They maybe know the athletic environment, they know the demands of specific sports or maybe sport in general. But if you were referring out, usually somebody with an RD would suffice. Now there are also individuals who don't have their RD but who are qualified with nutrition knowledge. However, their scope of practice is a little bit more limited. For instance, if there's a disease state or something that's affecting the actual health and well-being of an athlete, then you should pretty much go with a sports dietitian or a registered dietitian. Anything else, and it's outside of their scope of practice. So on that note, athletes with complex nutrition issues should be referred to a team physician or a sports dietitian. So somebody who can really handle those complex nutrition issues. A sports dietitian is an RD, a registered dietitian, but they have specific education and experience in sports nutrition. If you want to look for a sports dietitian or a registered dietitian, you can check out the Board Certified Specialist in Sports Dietetics, or the CSSD. Now, these are the responsibilities of an RD who is working with athletes. They should translate the latest scientific evidence so that we can all understand what the heck the nutrition research is talking about, what the latest recommendations are, and synthesize that for our knowledge so we don't have to sift through all of that information. Assess and analyze dietary practices, body composition, and energy balance of athletes. Okay, so assess and analyze. Dietary practices includes things like recall of past meals, so food logs and things like that. Interviews with athletes, just asking them what are their eating practices, observing them in the cafeteria or looking at what they put on their plate. Body composition, so taking body composition measurements, whether it's with skin fold calipers or an in-body machine or a bod pod or some other technique. And then the energy balance of athletes. So making sure that athletes are not in an energy deficit or they're not losing body mass in a way that is deleterious to health and performance. And they should also provide personalized meal and snack plans to promote achieving both short and long-term goals for athletic performance and good health. So a short-term goal might be arriving to a match sufficiently hydrated and with enough carbohydrate stores in order to make it through the full 90 minutes. A long-term goal might be adding 3 kilos of muscle mass over the first 2 years of the college sport experience. So both short and long-term goals, these are under the role of a sports nutrition professional. Now, the key point here is that experienced sport dietitians help athletes make the connection between the plate and performance, between what they put in their body and how they perform. They have advanced knowledge, skills, and expertise in sports nutrition to do so. Oftentimes, there's this assumption, I think, that we make as strength and conditioning coaches that because we tend to geek out about details and we tend to be hyper conscious about things like sets and reps and exercise selection and cueing and macronutrient intake and pre and post workout nutrition, we or at least I sometimes assume that my athletes know at least the basics of these things, when in reality oftentimes these athletes have little to no education regarding nutrition or best practices for either performance or health. So it's super important to be able to start that education process as soon as possible with the athletes to develop good habits so that they can habituate essentially to good eating, good healthy eating practices. So it's not just this constant reminder all the time and you're fighting against the current bad habits that they have. We want to instill good education and good habits from the get-go. Now, this brings us to the standard nutrition guidelines. MyPlate is a food guidance system similar to the food pyramid. So MyPlate, instead of a pyramid, it has like a plate with certain sections of the plate being filled in by different types of food. And that represents the quantity of different macronutrients or really whole foods that should be put on the plate. Now, MyPlate was developed for mostly sedentary individuals, not for athletes. So they may need to be adjusted. The suggestions and the ratios may need to be adjusted for anybody who's physically active for more than 30 minutes a day, which pretty much sums up just about every athlete. Now this table 9.2 from the text, this is MyPlate vegetable subgroup recommendations. This is just to give you an example of about how much vegetable material should be consumed by people that fall into different categories, okay? From children to girls, boys, female adults, and male adults with age ranges in there. So we have the different categories of vegetables: dark green, orange, beans and peas, starchy, and other types of vegetables. I don't know what falls in the other group, but I guess anything that's not in the first four. And you can see that, let's just use adult males as an example. This is the amount per week, so not per day. Don't be alarmed when you see 6 cups of red and orange vegetables per day and you're like, oh, I'm not really doing that. I'm not either, but this is per week. So maybe about a cup a day. You could take Sunday off from your vegetables and just rest from eating vegetables. But 6 cups per week of red and orange vegetables. So that's like red bell peppers, orange bell peppers. That's pretty much all I got off the top of my head. Beets are red. Tomatoes, those are red. Oranges don't count. I keep thinking of oranges, but those are fruits. But you get the picture. 2 cups of dark green vegetables. That would be like spinach or other dark leafy greens. I have seen different recommendations than this coming out, especially with the plant-based movement and more recent developments in trying to quantify what are they called? Phytonutrients, like the nutrients that maybe we don't have recommendations for. But this is at least a good starting point, and this is what MyPlate recommends. Now, we have to talk about DRIs, or dietary reference intakes. DRIs are a group of recommendations which give you at least a ballpark figure for how much of any given nutrient to intake. So we have the RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance. We have the AI, which is not artificial intelligence in this case, it's the adequate intake. UL is the tolerable upper level intake, and EAR is the estimated average requirement. Now, not every nutrient has all of these DRIs associated with it. Not everyone will have an RDA and an AI and a UL and an EAR. It depends on how much research and how thorough that research is and how obvious it is that this nutrient is required in certain amounts or toxic at certain levels. So yeah, it depends on the available information, whether it has one or more DRIs. So the recommended dietary allowance, this is the average daily nutrient requirement that's adequate for meeting the needs of most healthy people. Most healthy people, okay? Emphasis on most. Some people, maybe athletes who have high metabolisms, need to recover from things. Maybe they sometimes have slightly higher intakes. Or maybe if you're in a state of unhealth, in a disease state or something, perhaps you might require more of those nutrients. The adequate intake is the average daily nutrient intake level recommended when an RDA cannot be established. So this is in face of maybe underwhelming evidence for an RDA, we might have an adequate intake or an AI. The tolerable upper level intake, this is the maximum average daily nutrient. So this is the max that you should get, hence upper level. The maximum average daily nutrient level not associated with any adverse health effects. So does it guarantee that if you go above this, you'll have an adverse health effect? No, but you could. So it's recommended that you stay below the ULs. Estimated average requirement. This is the average daily nutrient intake level considered sufficient to meet the needs of half of the healthy population within each life stage and sex. Within half. And again, this is if we don't have enough information to establish a really good RDA, or if maybe there's so much variance within the population that you can't establish an RDA, then we might have an estimated average requirement. Okay, so those are the DRIs. This takes us now to macronutrients. And hopefully a lot of you know what macronutrients are, right? Does it fit your macros, bro? A lot of us have heard about that, have heard about macronutrient partitioning, but let's just take a brief review of what macronutrients are. So a macronutrient is a nutrient that is required in significant amounts in the diet. And there are three: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And actually alcohol is also considered a macronutrient with about 7 calories per gram. However, typically we're not recommending to our athletes to drink a ton of alcohol for health or performance, right? Well, depending on your sport. I mean, I've seen some sports where maybe some alcohol consumption post-match is part of the culture, but here we're not going to consider that. Okay, the first macronutrient to talk about, and arguably one of the most important for sport. However, if you're an endurance athlete, you may argue that maybe carbohydrate is more important. However, protein is often associated with muscle growth for good reason, and with levels of strength and with high performance in athletics. So we're going to talk about protein first. Now, any protein is made out of a bunch of different amino acids formed into polypeptide chains. And essentially, when you consume any type of protein, whether it's from meat or from dairy or fish, eggs, plants, it gets broken down into those amino acids. Now, 4 of these amino acids can be synthesized by the human body, and these are called the non-essential amino acids because your body can actually create them even if you're not getting them from your diet. And those are right here in this table, 9.3, the non-essential amino acids. 9 of them are considered essential, okay, right here. These 9 essential amino acids cannot be made within the body. Your body cannot manufacture them, so you have to go out and get them in your diet. And then 8 of them are considered conditionally essential. Now, conditionally essential means that in some cases of great distress or duress or sickness, your body might need more of them, and you might have to go get them from your diet. Your body cannot continue to make enough of them to meet the body's needs as it's recovering from some sort of traumatic injury or in the face of some big threat to homeostasis. So they're considered conditionally essential. Sometimes, in some conditions, you need to get them from the diet. Now, not all protein is the same. Plant protein, egg protein, fish protein, meat protein, whey protein, there's differences between all of those. It's not a one-to-one correspondence there. So one of the factors that is different between these different types of protein is protein digestibility. Now, protein digestibility is calculated by how much of the protein's nitrogen is absorbed during digestion, and by its ability to provide the amino acids necessary for growth, maintenance, and repair. So how many of those essential, non-essential, and conditionally essential amino acids are in this protein. Is it a complete protein with all of the amino acids, the full range? Is it an incomplete protein, as is often the case in plant proteins? Although if you mix and match, you can usually find a combination where you do get all of the amino acids. And how readily digestible is that protein? Can you use a very high percentage of it for recovery and growth and repair, or do you need to take in more of it to get the same effect? Now, typically, whey protein is going to have the highest protein availability and digestibility, followed, I think, don't quote me on this, I think by egg and meat protein, so like chicken and beef and egg, and then followed by various plant proteins. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go consume a ton of whey or casein protein or meat-based proteins only. Vegetarians and plant-based eaters and vegans can definitely hit these protein requirements. You might just have to work a little bit harder for it and take in more grams per kilogram of body weight, knowing that the protein digestibility is somewhat lower in plant-based proteins. Also, they usually don't taste as good, but I'm waiting on the food manufacturers to up their game. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have some delicious plant-based proteins and everyone can drink it. Right now, it's usually pretty gritty and gross, but hey, save lives, save animals, all that good stuff. The RDA for protein for adults is 0.8 grams per kilogram or 0.36 grams per pound of body weight for both men and women. That's pretty low, but remember, that's the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance. Now, I have heard very well-informed, very well-intentioned physiologists, usually exercise physiologists, who have said, hey, that's the RDA, so you really don't need to have any more protein than that, and anything more than that, you're just sort of pissing out. Like literally, you pee it out because your body just cycles it through the kidneys and then you pass it. However, that is not the case. There's a mountain of evidence contrary to that, and I think also a mountain of anecdotal evidence as well. That's very little protein. So 0.36 grams per pound will keep you literally from a diseased state. So it'll keep your muscles from wasting away, but that's just about it. That's not very much protein. Most athletes, the vast majority, need much more protein per kilogram or per pound than those numbers. Now, the AMDR for protein in adult men and women is between 10 and 35% of total calories. So whatever your total caloric intake is, or rather whatever it should be, your protein intake should be about 10 to 35% of that. So that's the lower range and then the upper range. Now, here are some concerns about the RDA for protein. For optimal bone health, adults may need more than the RDA. And another concern is that consistently high protein intakes, much higher than the RDA, this may compromise carbohydrate and fat intake. Okay, so perhaps maybe you're on a super high protein diet and you think, yeah, I'm going to eat all the protein all the time, bro. Well, you might be doing that and sacrificing your intake of carbohydrates. If you eat too much grilled chicken, you're just not going to have room for the pasta that you need to consume to replenish your muscle glycogen and to fuel your next workout. So don't just eat protein. Even if you're trying to grow muscle and be as hypertrophic as possible, you still need carbs and fats, obviously. Now, a key point here on protein. Athletes require more than the RDA for protein to build and repair muscle. Depending on the sport and the training program, between 1 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein is recommended. And I've also heard, you hear this from kind of the bodybuilding circles or typically from strength athletes, that you should intake 1 gram per pound of body weight. And I found that, at least for myself and for most of the athletes that I coach, if you stick to that, then there are some positive body composition outcomes from that. Maintenance of muscle mass, even in the face of voluminous training. Oftentimes some recomping can occur, especially if the athlete had a suboptimal diet before that recommendation, and then they really nail that 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. However, if you're an endurance athlete, you might need to have a very high intake of carbohydrate. And so to get both would just be too many calories. So depending on the type of athlete, maybe an endurance athlete would be on the lower end, a strength athlete would be on the upper end, a bodybuilder might be above that, slightly above that, up to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, maybe even 2.2 grams per kilogram. On to the next macronutrient, carbohydrates. The primary role of carbohydrates is to serve as an energy source. And because it's the primary role, you could actually cut out carbohydrates and be okay, right? As we've seen with the keto diet and Atkins before that, and fat-adapted athletes. However, most likely it's not optimal to do that. Research is somewhat equivocal, but leaning in the favor of carbohydrates just being a better fuel source. Take a look at the literature, see for yourself. Monosaccharides or saccharides. I never know if it's a hard C or a soft C. One of my nutrition friends, you can correct me in the comments below. I'm going to say it with a hard C. Monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose are single sugar molecules. Disaccharides, sucrose, sucrose, lactose, and maltose, these are composed of two simple sugar units joined together. And polysaccharides are known as complex carbohydrates, and they can contain up to 1,000 units of glucose. So these are like, chains of glucose all stuck together. Now, when we're talking about carbohydrates and food, especially whole foods, we have this index to rank essentially how quickly that carbohydrate hits the bloodstream. And this is called the glycemic index, or GI for short. The GI classifies food by how high and for how long it raises blood glucose. Now, foods that are digested very quickly have a high GI or high glycemic index. Because they're digested quickly, the glucose hits the bloodstream quickly and it rises quickly. And then insulin is pumped out in big quantities and it rises very sharply. Low glycemic index foods are the opposite. They digest very slowly, and so there's more of a gradual rise in blood glucose, and then insulin also has that sort of moderated response where the rise isn't too fast or too high. Now let's take a look at what some of these foods are. So low GI foods of 55 or less, these tend to be foods that are closer to their natural state, right? Or have more fiber in them or have more fat in them. Things like milk, soy, or dairy that have a fat component that slows digestion. Yogurts, fruit, because fruit has to, I believe, go through the liver first. I don't know. Again, check me on that physiology. Be processed in the liver before it's turned into glucose and then put into the bloodstream. Chocolate. Interestingly, apple juice, which I would think would be high GI because it's just, juice from an apple. It's like sugar in there, which is why we don't give it to our kids that often. However, again, I think there's a lot of fructose in there, so it's a low GI food. Medium GI foods are things like brown rice, couscous, honey, pineapple, popcorn, etc. You can read the list. And then high GI foods, these are often processed or starchy things, right? We see potatoes, we see cornflakes, watermelon. Oh man, the kids love watermelon. It's such a high GI food. White bread, white rice, even whole wheat bread can be high GI. Now, fiber is a carbohydrate. The DRI for fiber is 21 to 29 grams per day and 30 to 38 grams per day for women and men respectively. Oftentimes, however, in a Western diet, we don't get enough fiber, right? Because we're eating all this processed food where the fiber is taken out, and that's no bueno for your digestive system. Now, for some aerobic endurance athletes, this level of fiber might be excessive. Actually, funny story. Maybe I've even told this story before. This is a digression, but it's worth it. So stick with me. We were out to dinner the night before a big race, and I think I was a senior in college, and this freshman, maybe he was a sophomore, real great guy, and I played this mean trick on him. He asked me, he's like, hey Jacob, what should I eat before my race, right? He was running the 800 the next day. What should I eat before my race? And I told him, I was like, Matt, oops, I just gave away his name. I was like, Matt, eat just a huge plate of broccoli. It's going to clean you out. You'll be lighter for your race and therefore more efficient, right? And he bought it, hook, line, and sinker. So he just piled on. He had two big plates, heaping plates of raw broccoli, a ton of fiber. The next day, I felt pretty bad for him. He did end up racing well, but before the race and after the race, he had the worst case of the poops, pre-race and post-race that he had ever had in his life. It was really funny. So that was kind of gross. Hopefully YouTube doesn't censor that. Yeah, sorry, Matt. Okay, continued carbohydrate requirements. So aerobic endurance athletes who train for long durations should replenish glycogen levels by consuming maximum levels of carbohydrate. This is approximately, I don't know why there's a dash right there, approximately 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. That's a lot of carbs, right? So if let's say you're like a 60 kilo distance runner, that's 600 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot of carbohydrates. I mean, dang, that's a lot. And it's really hard to do that with whole food. So that's why we have things like Gatorade, right? You could just chug it down and get it in liquid form. Carbohydrates, remember, provide 4 calories per gram. So 600 grams of carbohydrate, 6 times 4, 2,400, that was bad math, 2,400 calories from that 600 grams of carbohydrate. That's a lot. Now, a key point with carbs is that athletes will adapt to dietary changes in carbohydrate intake. If you regularly consume carbohydrates, you will use them as a primary source of energy during aerobic exercise. But consistent low carbohydrate intake will lead to a greater reliance on fat as a fuel source. So this is called being fat adapted. A fat adapted athlete is somebody who takes in very little carbohydrate and they rely more on their fat stores as fuel. Now, speaking of fat, let's talk about fat as a macronutrient. Fat, also known as lipids, comes in different varieties or flavors, if you will. So fatty acids containing no double bonds are said to be saturated. Those containing one double bond are monounsaturated, and those containing 2 or more double bonds are polyunsaturated. And fats also pack a much denser caloric punch. They're 9 calories per gram. Now you can think of saturated fats, and because they have no double bonds in them, the chains are essentially straight, right? You can pack a lot more into a lot less area, and hence they are solid at room temperature just because they're packed more tightly. And then monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, things like olive oil, tend to be liquid at room temperature because the 1 or the 2 double bonds lead to more of like a jagged molecule, right? And so they don't pack as nicely, they fit together more haphazardly, and so they tend to be liquid at room temperature. Now, there is in the literature a relationship between fat and cholesterol. However, recently there's been a lot of sort of talk about how dietary intake of fat and even dietary intake of cholesterol are not necessarily associated with the measures of cholesterol and heart disease. So take this with a grain of salt, but high levels of total cholesterol, low density lipoproteins, and triglycerides are associated with increased risk of heart disease. So again, that's high levels of those measurements, not necessarily high levels of fat intake. However, it is pretty well established that saturated fats, and especially trans fats, we should limit our intake. We should not intake trans fats and limit our intake of saturated fats. High levels of HDLs, so the good kind of cholesterol, can protect against heart disease, and HDLs can be increased by exercise and weight loss. Okay, it is recommended that 10% or less of the calories consumed come from saturated fats, which would be about 1/3 of your total fat intake if you're intaking 30% of your calories in the form of fats. Now, for performance, intramuscular and circulating fatty acids are a great potential energy source during exercise because they really are not going to run out. It would be almost impossible to run out of your fat stores. Really, the only time we see human beings run out of fat stores are in cases of starvation. Fat stores are large and they represent a vast fuel source, as I just said. Consistent aerobic training, interestingly, increases the muscle's capacity to use fat as a fuel. When the intensity of exercise increases, however, there is a gradual shift from fat to carbohydrate. Okay, and if we recall back to chapter 3, I believe in the book, I was talking about those different energy systems. As you increase intensity from that aerobic oxidative intensity level, and then you get into the glycolytic system, that's where we start to see the shift because the demand for ATP just increases beyond the body's ability to supply it with those oxidative methods. Key point here, the human body has sufficient fat to fuel long training sessions or a competition, right? This is how we get through those 90+ minute training sessions, whether it's an aerobic endurance session or even repeated sprints like in soccer. All right, I know this lecture is getting long, but we are going to get through this chapter in one video. Okay, vitamins. These are organic substances, which means that they contain carbon atoms that cannot be synthesized by the body. So different from minerals. Minerals are inorganic, vitamins are organic. They are needed in very, very, very small amounts. That's why when you take a multivitamin, it's this big, right? They are needed in small amounts and perform specific metabolic functions. Now, minerals, these are required for also a wide variety of metabolic functions. When we're talking about athletes, minerals are most important for bone health, oxygen carrying capacity, and fluid and electrolyte balance, right? So we'll get into which minerals contribute to each of these. I'm sure you can guess for some of them. The first one to talk about is iron. Iron is a constituent of hemoglobin and myoglobin. This plays a key role in oxygen transport and utilization. Now, out of all the nutrition deficiencies that you could have, iron deficiency is the most prevalent in the world. All of the following are at increased risk of iron deficiency: women of childbearing age, teenage girls, pregnant women, infants, and toddlers. So I think we see a trend here. Women have a much harder time retaining their iron, and that's mostly due to menstruation and that cycle of losing blood, which contains a ton of iron in that hemoglobin, and then having to replenish that blood and replenish the hemoglobin, partly with the intake of iron. Now, calcium. Athletes who consume low calcium diets can be at risk of osteopenia and osteoporosis, which is which is the deterioration of bone tissue, leading to an increase in bone fragility and risk of fracture. Now, who might be consuming low calcium diets? Well, we have to watch out, especially for our plant-based athletes or our vegetarian and vegan athletes who may not be consuming as many animal products, and therefore things like milk and yogurt and cheese might not be on the menu for them. So we have to be sure that they're taking in calcium from other sources. There are some plant sources of calcium, or maybe even with some sort of a calcium supplement. All right, fluid and electrolyte balance. Now, water is the largest component of the body. I'm sure you've known that since like second grade when you learned that water represents like 60% of the body weight. In reality, it's from between 45 to 75% of a person's body weight. And we should be taking in between 3.7 and 2.7 liters per day for men and women, respectively. Okay, and again, that's just an average. So what we want to do as strength and conditioning coaches is to make sure that our athletes are arriving at the match or at the game or at practice properly hydrated, and make sure that they stay hydrated throughout that training session or that competition. So athletes should try to prevent water weight losses that exceed 2% of body weight. This is massively important because at around 2%, some literature even says less than that, maybe even 1% of loss in body weight due to water losses, we start to see massive decreases in performance that are considerable. Now, each pound lost during practice, each pound of body mass lost during practice due to sweat represents 16 ounces of fluid. Okay, so you can weigh your athletes pre-training and post-training. This is a great way to quantify sweat loss. It's much easier than an actual like sweat analysis and sweat loss test. Just weigh them pre and then weigh them post. Make sure they don't go number 2, because that will obviously change your measures. And then that will tell you how much sweat they are losing minus the amount that they're drinking, right, during practice. So obviously if you are losing 3 pounds, that represents 3 times 16, which is 48 fluid ounces, but maybe they consumed 16 ounces. So then it would actually be 4 pounds of body loss because they took in 1 pound of water, if you get that math. The key point here is that a very wide range of fluid losses in the form of sweat exists among athletes. You could have some athletes who just sweat a ton, right? They just walk out onto the field and they just start sweating buckets. Or you could have some athletes who barely seem to break a sweat. And sometimes within the same athlete, they might be excessively sweaty one day and not so much the other day, depending on their own hydration status, or maybe on how well acclimated they are to different environmental conditions. Therefore, each athlete should develop an individualized hydration plan, okay, working with a sports dietitian or the RD or the nutritionist to make sure that they are cognizant of the amount of sweat that they are sweating out, what the color of their pee is, which is a great indicator. There's a ton of validated sort of pee color scales that you can look at and say, oh, well, you're pretty well hydrated, or you're very dehydrated. Let's drink a bunch of water. Or weighing the athlete pre and post training. Now, the major electrolytes lost in sweat are sodium chloride and, to a lesser extent, potassium. These are the salts that come out during sweating, right? So that's why, like, if sweat drips down into your mouth, it tastes salty. Hyponatremia, this is something that can develop in those who exercise intensely and hydrate with only water. Hyponatremia is where you lose a ton of electrolytes and the sodium levels in your blood become very, very diluted, so less than 125 millimoles per liter. Athletes who exercise intensely or for hours, so either very high intensity or very long duration, and hydrate with only water, especially if they hydrate excessively with water, that doesn't have any or has very little sodium, they run the risk of hyponatremia, and it dilutes their blood sodium to dangerously low levels. That's why things like Gatorade are so beneficial. Sometimes watering down Gatorade is important, especially if you're not consuming any other water, right? Because you don't want to have hypernatremia. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, hypernatremia, where you have just too much solute in the blood. So occasionally watering it down 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 is beneficial depending on the duration and intensity and the weather outside. Now, fluid intake guidelines. At the start of exercise, we want to begin in a hydrated state. So pre-hydration is important if necessary, and you want to start several hours before exercise. So make sure that the athletes, when they wake up, they're drinking a glass of water, that they have sufficient water with breakfast, that they carry a water bottle with them throughout the day, that they bring their water bottle with them to practice to make sure that they are pre-hydrating. Now, during exercise, we want to avoid dehydrating. So before exercise, we want to pre-hydrate. During exercise, we want to avoid dehydration. And the different recommendations, say for children, we want to drink about 5 ounces of cold water or a flavored salted beverage like Gatorade every 20 minutes. Okay, so it's good for kids to have Gatorade at their soccer match. It's not just a sugary thing for them. Well, yes, it is sugary for them and they like it, but it's good for them. Adolescents, about 9 ounces, and adults can follow a more of an individualized hydration program, right? So for the kids and the adolescents, we don't necessarily have individualized guidelines. For adults, we can get more individualized, especially during prolonged hot weather activity. Sports drinks with 20 to 30 milliequivalents of sodium per liter, or 2 to 5 milliequivalents of potassium per liter, and 5 to 10% carbohydrate. Okay, so again, we're describing something like Gatorade or some other version of that. Now, before the next training session, we also want to encourage rehydration. Okay, so we prehydrate, we don't dehydrate, and then we rehydrate. Athletes should consume 1.5 liters of water for every kilogram of body weight lost. And there you go. Okay, that was a doozy. Thanks for making it with me through all of chapter 9. Remember that this was nutrition recommendations for health, not necessarily for performance, but we in this chapter are learning about how to maintain the health of our athletes and improve the health of our athletes. Chapter 10, which we'll be covering next, this chapter now talks about what to do to optimize performance. So we'll talk about body composition alteration in greater detail. We'll talk about macronutrient distribution surrounding training and all of that kind of fun stuff. So stay tuned, click over to that video. When it's posted, it'll pop up somewhere on the screen. If you guys are enjoying the content or you're studying for the CSCS, please subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. And spread the word. Pass these videos out to your other friends who are studying for the test and or who just want to up their game as strength and conditioning coaches or sport performance specialists. I will see you guys on the next video. Stupid. Excuse me. Do over. Whew, that was a doozy. That was a long chapter. Goodbye.